Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island located about 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. With just over 8 square miles, its appearance resembled a black scar on the sea. Uneven terrain, covered by volcanic sand and sulfur fumes, the result of constant geological activity. There were no rivers, significant vegetation, or any kind of natural shelter. Although it seemed like an insignificant territory, the island was of immense strategic value to American forces during World War II. It was located exactly between the Mariana Islands, where the B-29 bomber bases were located, and Japanese territory. Controlling Iwo Jima meant securing a crucial foothold for air operations against Japan, serving both as an escort base for fighters and as an emergency runway for bombers damaged after missions over enemy territory. The importance of the island had been identified by the Japanese High Command as early as 1944. Under the leadership of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese garrison began one of the most complex and carefully planned defenses of the entire Pacific War. Unlike other islands where the Japanese had adopted tactics of frontal attacks and suicide charges, Kuribayashi devised a strategy of prolonged resistance based on the psychological and physical attrition of the invading forces. He understood that it would not be possible to defeat the United States militarily, but he intended to make every meter of enemy advance as costly as possible. To this end, Iwo Jima was transformed into an underground fortress. Over months of intense labor, thousands of soldiers dug more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, creating an underground defensive network that included ammunition depots, shelters, command centers, observation posts, machine gun positions, artillery, and mortars. The entrances to these tunnels were carefully camouflaged with rocks and vegetation. The firing positions, known as pillboxes, were reinforced with concrete and steel, and designed so that each could cover the other, forming a virtually impenetrable crossfire. This underground architecture made the Japanese positions almost invisible to aerial observation and extremely resistant to naval and aerial bombardment. Among the most notable defenses was Mount Suribachi, an ancient volcanic cone about 160 meters high, located at the southern end of the island. It served as a natural observation point and control center for much of the Japanese artillery. From there, observers could guide fire with pinpoint accuracy onto the landing beaches. Every cave and tunnel was designed to allow Japanese forces to disappear underground during bombing raids and reappear as soon as the enemy approached, turning the terrain into a deadly trap. In preparation for the invasion, the United States launched one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. For 72 consecutive days, B-24 aircraft and warships fired on the island. It is estimated that more than 5,800 tons of bombs and 22,000 naval shells were dropped on Iwo Jima. However, the practical results were limited. The underground defensive structure remained almost intact, and most of the Japanese troops survived the initial attacks. When the bombing ceased, only the surface had been devastated. The interior of the island remained operational. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the landing of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions of the United States began, supported by hundreds of amphibious vessels and vehicles. The attack was preceded by a new round of naval bombardment, which raised thick clouds of smoke and dust over the coast. At 9 a.m., the first waves of Higgins boats, the landing craft, began to reach the beach. Approximately 30,000 men participated in the first assault. The American plan called for a relatively quick conquest. The terrain appeared uninhabited, and reconnaissance reports indicated little visible resistance. The first few minutes were marked by a tense calm. The Marines found it difficult to move due to the fine, slippery volcanic sand, which sank under the weight of each step. Tanks and amphibious vehicles got stuck, tracks got caught, and movement was slow. There was little or no natural cover, and the troops were completely exposed as they advanced inland. For almost an hour, there was no enemy fire. Many believed that the bombing had eliminated the Japanese forces. However, the silence was part of Kuribayashi's strategy. As soon as the beaches were crowded and American formations were compressed in the landing areas, the Japanese opened fire. In a matter of seconds, the island's slopes exploded in flames and shrapnel. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns fired from hidden positions, hitting the troops at the very moment when they were most vulnerable. The shots came from all angles, from the front, the flanks, and even from behind, coming from camouflaged openings in the hills. The American bombardment had destroyed only the surface structures, but the Japanese remained sheltered and coordinated underground. The immediate result was chaos. Vehicles caught fire, radios were destroyed, and the first platoons suffered heavy casualties. Doctors and nurses tried to rescue the wounded under continuous bombardment. The beaches became a killing field, with bodies mixed with black sand and wreckage from boats. The planned advance turned into a fight for survival. Communications were interrupted and the chain of command was disrupted, making any tactical coordination difficult. Even so, the American divisions managed to establish a beachhead on the first day. The conquest of territory, however, cost thousands of lives and revealed the true challenge of the campaign. The enemy was not just hiding. They controlled the battlefield from underground. Every hill, every crater, and every bunker was interconnected. When one position was taken, the Japanese would retreat through tunnels and reappear at other points, attacking from behind or emerging between American lines. The terrain itself functioned as a living, adaptable, and deadly defensive system. General Kuribayashi had instructed his troops not to carry out immediate suicide attacks, such as the famous banzai charges of previous campaigns. His intention was to maximize the damage caused to the Americans by prolonging the fighting and maintaining control for weeks. This decision made the Battle of Iwo Jima one of the longest and bloodiest in the Pacific theater. The United States forces, accustomed to facing enemies who surrendered quickly or fought to the death in direct confrontations, now found themselves facing an adversary who operated with patience, precision, and tactical discipline. From the second day on, American troops realized they were facing a different kind of war, an underground war. Air and naval superiority was of limited use against an enemy that was virtually invisible. Bombs couldn't reach the deep tunnels, and artillery fire only served to displace sand without effectively neutralizing the defenses. The advance became methodical and costly, meter by meter, requiring the manual clearing of each tunnel and cave. Within hours, Iwo Jima became the picture of a battle of total exhaustion. The initial plan for a quick conquest gave way to a prolonged operation marked by improvisation, constant losses, and logistical challenges. Japanese resistance not only slowed the American advance, but also tested the limits of traditional combat strategies. It was in this context that new weapons and tactics, including flamethrowers, were reintroduced as a direct response to a type of fortification that no conventional artillery seemed capable of destroying. As American forces consolidated their position on the beaches of Iwo Jima, the advance inland revealed the true nature of the Japanese defense. The uneven topography, formed by volcanic ash and rock, concealed a network of tunnels, caves, and shelters that extended across the entire island. Every meter gained required hand-to-hand combat, and every hill taken could become a new point of attack minutes later. American troops quickly realized that there was no defined front line. The enemy could emerge from any direction, from underground or through openings disguised in the landscape. The battlefield, which at first seemed limited to the surface, was in fact three-dimensional. The Japanese had turned each defensive structure into a carefully designed trap. The so-called pillboxes, small reinforced concrete bunkers, were positioned so that one covered the other, creating overlapping fields of fire. Their openings were narrow and camouflaged, making them difficult to detect and preventing explosives or grenades from causing direct damage. Many of these shelters were connected by underground tunnels that allowed troops to reposition and resupply ammunition without exposure to enemy fire. The destruction of a bunker rarely meant the end of the threat. Within hours, Japanese combatants would reappear, reoccupying the position or emerging in locations considered safe. American conventional combat doctrine proved ineffective against this type of defense. Artillery and bombing could not penetrate the layers of rock and concrete. The use of grenades and rifles in confined spaces was limited. The Japanese, protected by tunnels and narrow passages, fired and retreated before they could be hit. In response, engineers and commanders began to seek alternative methods of underground combat. It was in this context that an old weapon, little used since World War I, was once again employed on a large scale: the flamethrower. The M2 model was the main equipment adopted by the Marines during the campaign. Weighing about 70 pounds when fully loaded, the system consisted of 2 fuel tanks and a central cylinder of compressed nitrogen, which served as a propellant. The operator carried the assembly on his back, connected by hoses to a metal lance equipped with a small white phosphorus ignition device. The fuel used was a thick mixture of gasoline and oil, known as napalm in its primitive form. When expelled, the flaming liquid would adhere to any surface, burning at extreme temperatures and consuming the oxygen inside tunnels and shelters. The effective range of the M2 was approximately 30 yards, and its autonomy was only 10 seconds of continuous fire. Despite its limitations, its effect in enclosed spaces was devastating. The flames penetrated openings, vents, and air intakes, completely neutralizing enemy positions. However, operating the flamethrower required not only technical skill, but also extraordinary courage. The equipment made the soldier a visible and priority target. The glow of the flames and the shape of the tanks immediately gave him away, making him the focus of Japanese snipers. Combat reports record that the average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Iwo Jima was a few minutes after entering action. Still, they were essential to clear a path through the tunnels and allow the companies to advance. Support teams often worked in pairs. A soldier armed with a rifle protected the operator as he approached the openings and fired short, accurate shots. When the fuel ran out, the operator had to retreat quickly, reload, and return. This routine was repeated dozens of times a day, under constant risk of explosion or ambush. The efficiency of the flamethrower led to the development of a combined tactic, in which infantry and tank units worked in sync. The tanks provided cover and fired at the larger openings, while the operators approached the smaller entrances. Even so, progress was slow. The extreme heat, the smell of fuel, and the thick smoke made the environment almost unbearable. Communication was difficult, and operators often acted in isolation, without visual contact with their teams. The weapon was not new, but its use on Iwo Jima marked a turning point in the Pacific War. It proved to be one of the few effective ways to combat an enemy entrenched in concrete structures. Its tactical impact was immediate. From the third day of combat, units equipped with flamethrowers began to be assigned to specific missions to eliminate fortified positions. In some sectors, reports indicate that more than 60% of Japanese shelters were neutralized by direct fire from flamethrowers. Technical difficulties remained, however. Fuel tanks, although robust, were vulnerable to direct hits. The risk of leakage or accidental ignition was constant. There was also the problem of terrain. Volcanic sand made movement difficult and increased the physical fatigue of the operator, who already carried about 30 kilograms of equipment on his back. Even with intensive training, few were able to keep up the pace in prolonged combat. The combination of efficiency and vulnerability led military engineers to seek a mechanized alternative. The solution came in the form of a modified tank, the M4A3R3 Sherman, known as the Flame Sherman. This vehicle replaced the main cannon with a long-range flamethrower system, with a capacity of up to 300 gallons of fuel and a range of over 100 yards. Unlike foot soldiers, the tank could approach fortified positions with relative safety, protected by its armor. The bursts of fire were controlled internally, allowing successive shots without exposing the crew. The introduction of the Flame Shermans significantly altered the tactical balance on Iwo Jima. For the first time, the Americans were able to directly attack cave and bunker entrances without relying on frontal approaches. The psychological impact was also remarkable. The presence of flamethrower tanks led several Japanese units to abandon positions previously considered impenetrable. Still, the risks persisted. Landmines, anti-tank guns, and explosive traps remained constant threats. On several occasions, tanks were destroyed after hitting unstable areas or being surrounded by enemy forces. Even with these losses, the systematic use of flamethrowers, both portable and mechanized, established itself as one of the decisive elements of the operation. The fire forced defenders to expose themselves, disrupted underground communication lines, and drastically reduced the number of successful ambushes. By the end of the second week, the American strategy had completely adapted to the island's geography. The advance, though slow and costly, became more predictable and controlled. The intensive use of this weapon also required logistical reorganization. Supply units began transporting large volumes of flammable fuel to the front lines, and specialized maintenance teams were assigned to ensure the constant functioning of the ignition systems. Operator training was adjusted in the field, based on observations made during combat. The standardization of tactics allowed entire companies to act more efficiently, reducing exposure and increasing responsiveness in critical situations. The operation in Iwo Jima became a laboratory for engineering and adaptation in warfare. Every move was studied. Every failure resulted in a new modification. The experiences accumulated there would later be applied in Okinawa and other Pacific islands. Despite extreme conditions and high mortality rates, American forces gradually began to understand the workings of the enemy's underground fortress and find ways to neutralize it with increasing precision. From that point on, the Battle of Iwo Jima ceased to be just a dispute over territory and came to represent the refinement of military techniques that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign. It was a brutal learning process, but necessary to overcome a type of warfare that no previous doctrine had anticipated. Fire became, paradoxically, the most efficient tool for conquering a land born of fire. And if you want to continue following real stories that show how strategy and technology shaped the outcomes of war, consider subscribing. It helps us keep this kind of historical content alive and accessible. As the weeks passed, the use of portable flamethrowers on Iwo Jima became unsustainable. Casualties among operators were extremely high, and the constant need for refueling limited the weapon's tactical effectiveness. On average, for each mission, only 1 in 10 soldiers assigned to operate an M2 managed to return unharmed. The equipment, while effective in eliminating fortified positions, exposed the operator directly and immediately to enemy fire. The distinctive silhouette, visible tanks, and glow of the flames made these men priority targets. Combat reports indicate that the average life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in the field was less than 5 minutes after the start of a raid. Faced with this reality, American commanders concluded that the survival of the operation required a mechanized solution. The answer came in the form of a modified vehicle, the M4A3R3 Sherman, nicknamed the Flame Sherman. It was an adaptation of the M4 medium tank, in which the main gun had been replaced by a high-pressure flamethrower connected to internal fuel tanks. This modification completely changed the dynamics of combat on Iwo Jima. The new weapon had a range of approximately 100 yards, more than 3 times the range of the portable model, and its fuel capacity was increased to about 300 gallons. The tank's armor provided protection against small arms, allowing crews to approach Japanese fortifications with less risk. The Flame Shermans began operating alongside infantry units and conventional tanks. The coordination was precise. The flamethrower tanks positioned themselves at the front, clearing the way with concentrated jets of fire, while the other vehicles provided flanking cover and fired at anti-tank positions. The infantry advanced close behind, taking advantage of the disorganization of the defenses to occupy the terrain. This tactic of mutual support showed immediate results. The intense heat generated by the flames penetrated openings and tunnels, destroying ammunition, consuming oxygen, and forcing defenders to abandon their positions. Despite its efficiency, the risks did not disappear. The island's volcanic terrain hampered the mobility of armored vehicles. The soft sand and steep slopes often caused the tanks to get stuck, turning them into easy targets for anti-tank guns and hidden mines. The internal heat combined with the flammable fuel stored inside made any impact a potential disaster. Still, the demand for these tanks increased. In less than 2 weeks, the number of Flame Shermans in operation doubled, and they were used in almost every sector of the front line. Reports from the units operating the equipment describe a weapon of great psychological power. The columns of fire could reach heights of over 20 meters, and the sight of the erupting jet caused panic among the defenders. Many Japanese soldiers, previously willing to fight to the end, abandoned their positions at the first shot from a flamethrower tank. The sound and visual impact of the fire created a sense of inevitability. Resistance meant being completely consumed. This reaction was exploited tactically by the Americans, who used fear as an additional tool to weaken resistance. It was in this context that the most documented episode involving the use of flamethrowers on Iwo Jima took place. The mission of Herschel Woody Williams. Born in rural West Virginia, Williams had joined the Marine Corps in 1943 and arrived on Iwo Jima with the 21st Marine Division. On February 23, 1945, the same day the American flag would be raised on Mount Suribachi, his company was pinned down under heavy fire in a heavily fortified sector of the island. Several attempts to advance had failed and casualties were mounting rapidly. The Japanese positions were protected by a series of interconnected pillboxes, each covering the other, so that any direct approach resulted in immediate casualties. Williams volunteered to try to eliminate these positions using the M2 flamethrower. With a small covering group, he began a series of isolated attacks, approaching enemy openings under constant machine gun fire. The equipment's fuel lasted only a few seconds, forcing him to return several times to refuel. For several hours, he traversed the battlefield, alternating between attacks and retreats. At one point, 2 of the Marines accompanying him were killed, but Williams continued. By the end of the operation, 7 fortified positions had been destroyed. The way was clear for the company to advance, and they managed to break through the Japanese defense line in that area. For this action, Herschel Woody Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military distinction in the United States, becoming the only flamethrower operator in World War II to receive such recognition. Williams's case exemplified the decisive, albeit limited role of flamethrowers on Iwo Jima. His isolated action represented, on a small scale, the collective effort that was repeated throughout the island. Small groups advancing under intense fire to destroy almost inaccessible underground positions. These attacks, combined with the support of the Flame Shermans, were instrumental in breaking Japanese resistance in the central and northern sectors of the island. From an operational standpoint, the conquest of Iwo Jima only became feasible after the complete integration of these new tactics. The combined use of fire and armor reduced the advantage of underground fortifications and allowed for a gradual, albeit still extremely costly advance. It is estimated that more than 26,000 Americans were wounded and nearly 7,000 killed during the campaign, while virtually the entire Japanese garrison was eliminated. The battle, which was supposed to last a few days, lasted more than a month. From a strategic point of view, the result justified the sacrifice. The capture of the island provided the United States with a key airbase for subsequent operations in the Pacific. From March 1945 onwards, aircraft damaged in missions over Japan began to use Iwo Jima as an emergency landing strip. It is estimated that more than 2,400 aircraft landed there, saving thousands of crew members. In addition, its proximity to the Japanese archipelago allowed for direct monitoring of heavy bombers, shortening flight times, and increasing mission safety. The advance on Iwo Jima also served as a basis for planning the invasion of Okinawa, which began weeks later. Many of the lessons learned during this campaign were immediately applied. Among them were the importance of cooperation between tanks and infantry, the controlled use of fire to neutralize underground defenses, and the value of combined arms in hostile environments. The flamethrower, despite its limited tactical nature, proved to be an indispensable tool in close-range combat against fortifications. The operation also marked a moment of technological and doctrinal transition. The war in the Pacific required constant adaptation, and Iwo Jima showed how innovation could arise from improvisation. The M4A3R3 Flame Sherman, for example, represented one of the first systematic applications of liquid firearms integrated into armored vehicles, a concept that would influence the development of similar equipment in the following decades. By the end of the third week of fighting, Japanese resistance had been virtually neutralized. Mount Suribachi, symbol of the island's most resistant fortification, was already under American control. Even so, isolated pockets of resistance continued to fight for more than 15 days, using tunnels and caves as their last refuge. The complete capture of Iwo Jima was officially declared on March 26, 1945. The American victory was the direct result of a combination of firepower, tactical adaptation, and operational persistence. Flamethrowers, both portable and mechanized, played a key role in this process, eliminating the Japanese's main defensive advantage: underground invulnerability. The success of this strategy, however, also highlighted the high human cost involved. Every meter gained was measured in lives, and every advance depended on decisions made under extreme conditions. The Battle of Iwo Jima, more than an isolated episode, represented the peak of the war of attrition in the Pacific, where technology, logistics, and human endurance intertwined in unprecedented proportions. With the end of the fighting on Iwo Jima, the impact of the confrontation began to be measured in numbers and strategic consequences. The battle, which officially lasted from February 19th to March 26th, 1945, was costly for both sides. It is estimated that about 21,000 Japanese soldiers were entrenched on the island at the start of the invasion. Of these, more than 20,000 were killed. Only about 200 were captured alive, many seriously wounded. On the American side, casualties exceeded 26,000 men, with approximately 7,000 killed in combat. The final tally cemented Iwo Jima as one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of World War II in the Pacific. The strategic outcome, however, was significant. The island, taken at a high cost, became an essential logistical point for air operations against Japan. Starting in April 1945, the runways of Iwo Jima began to receive damaged B-29 bombers on missions over Japanese territory. Later reports from the American Air Command indicated that more than 2,400 aircraft were able to make emergency landings there, saving thousands of lives and preserving a substantial amount of equipment. In addition, the island served as a forward base for escort fighters, increasing the range and protection of air fleets during bombings over Tokyo and other cities. Despite the military victory, the human dimension of the battle raised profound discussions within the U.S. Armed Forces and among historians. The large-scale use of flamethrowers, both portable and tank-mounted, was one of the most striking aspects of the campaign. In terms of tactical efficiency, the weapon fulfilled its role by eliminating fortified positions and reducing the number of Japanese suicide attacks. However, the costs associated with its use were significant. Of the 335 flamethrower operators assigned to the campaign, only 18 returned alive, resulting in a mortality rate of approximately 92%. These figures highlight the extreme vulnerability of the troops tasked with operating this technology. The effectiveness of liquid fire on Iwo Jima inspired subsequent analyses of the balance between tactical innovation and human cost. For the American High Command, the flamethrower was a weapon of necessity, not choice. Without it, the capture of the island would likely have dragged on for months and caused even more casualties. However, within the troops themselves, reports indicate that many operators, even those recognized for their bravery, avoided talking about their experiences after the war ended. The device that ensured the unit's survival also represented, for those who operated it, the most direct symbol of total destruction. After the end of the conflict, the role of flamethrowers in Iwo Jima began to be studied in tactical manuals and American military academies. The lessons learned on that island served as the basis for the development of new methods of underground and urban combat. The tactics applied in 1945 were later adapted in campaigns in Vietnam and Korea, albeit in different contexts and with more sophisticated weaponry. Even so, the image of fire as a tool of war remained a point of debate within the international community. Over the years, public perception of the use of incendiary weapons has changed. The brutality observed in Iwo Jima and other theaters of operation raised ethical questions about the use of such methods. In 1980, the United Nations included incendiary weapons, a category that includes flamethrowers, in an international treaty of restrictions, known as the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. Although the treaty did not completely ban the military use of such equipment, it imposed severe limitations, especially on its use in civilian areas. The U.S. Army itself gradually withdrew flamethrowers from its active arsenal in the following decades. In 1978, the Pentagon officially announced the end of the weapons use in regular units. The justification given was technical. Advances in precision explosives, thermobaric munitions, and chemical weapons had rendered the flamethrower obsolete. But internal reports and statements from veterans make it clear that the decision was also moral in nature. The experience at Iwo Jima had left deep scars on the image of the armed forces and on the combatants themselves who survived the campaign. Among these survivors was Herschel Woody Williams, the only flamethrower operator awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Iwo Jima. Williams lived until 2022, becoming one of the last direct representatives of that generation. In interviews given decades after the war, he acknowledged that he remembered little about the details of the battle, but he never forgot his comrades who did not return. The collective memory of his actions exemplifies the paradox of modern warfare. Victory achieved through instruments that, although effective, left a legacy of suffering and ethical dilemmas. The case of Iwo Jima became a milestone in the study of the psychological impact of war. Research conducted in the following years showed that flamethrower operators had higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than soldiers in other specialties. Military doctors attributed this difference to the nature of combat in confined spaces and direct exposure to the consequences of fire. This data reinforced the need for special attention to the mental health of combatants, something that had been neglected until then. From a historical point of view, Iwo Jima was the prelude to the final offensive against Japan. The conquest of the island allowed the United States to project direct air power over enemy territory and contributed to accelerating the outcome of the war. A few months later, in August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would end the conflict in the Pacific. Still, the operation in Iwo Jima remains an example of the transition from conventional warfare to the technological era. It was the moment when military efficiency and human limits clash directly. The story of flamethrowers and their operators reveals more than a military episode. It exposes the complexity of decisions made under extreme pressure. The innovation that led to victory also raised questions about the limits of modern warfare. The lessons of Iwo Jima continue to be studied in military academies, museums, and research centers, both for their tactical effectiveness and their ethical implications. The episode shows how, in certain contexts, victory can be inseparable from sacrifice and its lasting consequences. Of all the campaigns of World War II, Iwo Jima remains among the most studied. Its terrain, underground defenses, and resistance tactics are still analyzed as examples of military engineering and strategy. At the same time, the use of incendiary weapons in that battle continues to inspire debates about the moral limits of war. Among those who participated, few considered fire a glorious weapon. For most, it was simply a necessity imposed by circumstances. Enjoy the video, share it with others who are also interested in military history, and subscribe to the channel. This helps keep this work independent and in-depth. And now, we want to know your opinion. Given everything that has been documented, what do you think could have been different at Iwo Jima?